Hello, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, with Judeo-Christian values and real-world first-hand experience. Coming at you right now from the Walmart parking lot closest to where, the closest city to where I live. Why? Because I'm looking at mountains full of smoke right now, a sky full of smoke. Bug out actual number 2 for the year. I can't tell for sure, but I believe on the road I took my dog running on this morning, there is pretty substantial wildfire. I was at the gym. I saw it. If you guys probably don't know, but the gym is between 5 and 10 miles from my house, and by the time I got home, it was probably double the size and quite a bit larger by the time I left. By God's grace, we were out of there safely. If you hear my phone going crazy, it is government alerts, set status, evacuation, whatever. If you hear other things, it is probably people driving by, because I'm literally in the parking lot with my puppy. And by God's grace, the things that He's blessed us with. So there is that, but as they say, the show must go on. Where was I? The show must go on. So, with that, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review of the podcast. Hit a couple of stars if that's applicable on the app you're listening to. Leave a review. That'd be great. If you want to check out more, please consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com. First and foremost, I am a servant of God. Preacher, a fisher of men. God is number one in my life, and everything that I do in this podcast is no different, and I don't apologize for that. A little bit about me in the background. I grew up, I guess what you would consider a heathen. Didn't grow up a Christian, but I grew up in the southeastern United States, what most would consider very poor. Hunting and fishing and shooting. Joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. After my combat tours in Iraq, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in law enforcement for several years in LAPD. I worked patrol assignments and more specialized assignments, where by God's grace, He got me through some nasty places in this world of war zones and some of the nastiest streets in the country. Not because I am better, because God chose to have mercy on me and had a purpose for me, and I'm thankful for that. After my time in law enforcement, I was a private contractor for federal government, for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify, doing private contracting work. I'm very much involved in guns and gunfighting. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. I should say my primary MOS is in both branches of the military or infantry, as of one sort or another. Specialized infantry in the Marine Corps and an MOS that no longer exists. I started competition shooting even before I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I won my first gold medal even before I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I've been blessed by God with the talents He's given me to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. I've won most of my competitions in rifle and pistol, but I've also competed in archery and shotgun and even muzzleloader, knife throwing, hatchet throwing. I've competed in all that. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide. Like I said, I grew up hunting and fishing and shooting. I've done it to put meat on the table because I like to put food on the table with the talents God's given me. I don't apologize for that. I've done it as a professional hunter and guide. I've slain all manner of beast and guided for all manner of beast. Bear and wolf and elk and deer, mule deer, whitetail deer. I've slain ram and fallow deer and countless animals. And I don't apologize for that either. FBI certified, firearms instructor, NRA, and a bunch of other 3-letter government agency certifications. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Psalm 144. I've been blessed to be the commander of a tactical team, an SRT special response team in a large metropolitan area, where our primary job was to stop active shooters. But again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, called by God to share the good news, preacher, a fisher of men. With that, we will roll into the day's topic. With that, let's get into today's topic. Now, you guys know we've been doing a lot on shotguns and nerding out on shotguns, but not everybody's a shotgun person, and I didn't want to overwhelm everybody and just do that for a couple of weeks. So we're going to switch gears and we're going to nerd out on something completely different. We're going to nerd out on the 9mm, the 9mm Parabellum, the 9mm Luger, the 9x19, the 9, whatever you want to call it. Same thing. Not to be confused with the 9x18 or the 9 Kurtz, which are different. But the 9mm has become the de facto go-to police military defensive round of our time, and for good reason. If you guys listened before, you've heard me talk about this, but if you haven't, I know we get new listeners by God's grace all the time. So, back in the day, I was a police officer. I was issued a Glock 22, which is a 40 cal, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst handguns. Probably not worst as in like reliability, but it's not a great choice. Worst is a bad word. Let's say it is not even in the top 100 choices I would give people as a defensive handgun. But that's what I was issued, and quickly after my first shooting competition when I was a police officer, realized that I was not a very good pistol shooter. I was probably above average as far as cops go, and I thought that made me a good pistol shooter. But I quickly got schooled when I went to my first competition and realized that I was not. And by God's grace, I didn't give up. I pushed on like alpha males do and became better and better until I was winning competitions and championships. And not to get into that, but that helped me realize that the 40 kind of sucked for a lot of things. It was not great. I went from 40 to 45 because back in the day, everybody said that 9mm was kind of substandard. Or at least not everybody, but that was let's just say that was the pervasive thought, was 9mm was not enough. So I started shooting and I switched to 45, and I quickly realized I could load more and shoot more and practice more with a 9mm. Also, when I ran it on the clock, like how many rounds could I get in a kill zone in a center mass area in a certain amount of time, I really decided for myself that 9mm was kind of the de facto way to go. And this was long before everybody else decided that, you know what, the 9mm is it. And I was carrying that at a time when everybody thought you had to carry a 40 or maybe a 45. Those were permissible. But a 9mm, a lot of people thought that just wasn't enough. But obviously, I was not the only one to come up with that conclusion. A lot of people in the past several years, maybe the past decade, have come to that same realization that 9mm really is kind of the go-to de facto round for, again, police, military, law enforcement. With that said, that has given us a plethora, a great resurgence in 9mm and a great development of the 9mm round, which is fantastic. Again, I think that is great. I got nothing against that. I think that is fantastic, and that's one of the reasons the 9mm, I believe, has become so good at defensive use and military and police use, is that the development that has gone into it. And when you put that much development and R&D into something, it gets better. And with that also comes a lot of options, and with options can come analysis paralysis. So we're going to nerd out today, and I'm going to give you my point of view. And again, everybody has their own opinions, and just because these are mine and other people's are different does not make me better than them or anything. But as we talk about in the beginning, and one of the things that makes this podcast a little different is that I come at this from real-world first-hand experience. You've heard my background, and that obviously influences the opinions and thoughts that I have. So with that, let's get into a deep dive and nerd out of the 9mm. I guess we'll start at the front. We'll start at bullet weights. 9mm is kind of unique in that it straddles that line of subsonic versus supersonic. There you get average loadings, and I say average, nothing outside the norm, anywhere from 115 grain to 147 grain. You can go lighter than that, especially with these boutique rounds, and you can go heavier than that. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that the standard bullet weight range is 115 to 147. Now your 115s, your 124s, they're generally going to be supersonic. And the speed of sound varies depending on all kinds of factors. But let's call it 1050 feet per second. And generally, your 115s and 124s are going to be above that. And your 147s are going to be below that. So right there off the bat, you get great versatility in that you can have supersonic and subsonics. Now there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Your 115s are probably your most common for an obvious reason, in that there's less material, so there's less material cost. So they're cheaper to make. So they tend to be the most common. A lot of people buy what's cheapest. So with that being said, your 115 grains are going to be your most common. Now this is coming at you from the Hornady Reloading Manual. And just realize that the Hornady Reloading Manual is pretty conservative, meaning you can get factory loads, or if you want to push it even load your own hotter than this. But per my Hornady Reloading Manual, again, because I am in the Walmart parking lot recording this, the max loads on there are 115 grain at 1250 feet per second. So 115 grains, about 1250 feet per second. I'd say anywhere between 1150 and 1250 is pretty common for ammunition. And one of your most common loadings is what's going to be called a NATO load, which is generally 124 grain. Now my Hornady Reloading Manual lists the 124s at 1150 feet per second. And that's a standard loading. Realize that in NATO, European countries, they generally load ammunition hotter than we do here in the States. So a typical NATO loading is what we would consider in America plus P, plus power load, plus pressure load. So just realize that, but just to give you some numbers to nerd out on. And then your 147 grain is going to be at right around 1,000 feet per second, which in general, again, is going to be subsonic. So, and that's a pretty hot load, a 147 at 1,000 feet per second, to give you an idea of different bullet weights and different loads. Now, there are some in the middle. 135 grain Hornady is made popular in their FBI load, their critical duty load. Now we'll talk about bullet shapes. Bullet shapes for me are one of probably the most underrated and not talked about things when it comes to ammunition, especially pistol ammunition. Again, your most common range fodder, 115 grain, bulk, whatever brand XYZ, is just going to be a round nose full metal jacket bullet. That's your most common, and in my opinion, probably the worst for terminal ballistics. But that is your most common. You can get round nose when you get up into the 147s, but for me, the 147s usually have a flat point truncated cone design, which I find much better, even if it's not an expanding round, even if it's just what we consider a ball round, even if it's just a full metal jacket round. It tends to do better ballistically than just a straight round gumdrop shaped bullet. That flat point tends to disrupt more things when it goes through it. It also tends to continue in a straight line better if it gets going through barriers than just your round nose bullet does. Round nose bullets tend to get deflected more easily than a flat nose bullet. And a truncated cone design is not exactly a semi-wad cutter, but it's a lot closer than a round nose bullet. For all those reasons, I prefer truncated cone bullets. And no matter how good hollow points are, sometimes they just don't expand. No matter how good they're designed, no matter how much they cost, sometimes they don't expand. And if those bullets are not going to expand, I still want them to do better ballistically, whether they expand or not. For that reason, I like the truncated cone bullets. Now, they probably do somewhere somebody probably makes, because there's such a variety, a truncated cone flat nose type bullet, even in lower weights, 124s or 115s. I can't think of any, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. Generally, your 147 grains are going to be that. They kind of have to be flat nose just to fit in the magazine and feed in the gun. I had a Donny Park. Yeah. Yeah, it's on the, like, going to the Grand Canyon North. Yeah. I'll probably just leave that in, because if I keep stopping, it'll take a long time to get through this. Anyway, bullet shape to me is a very underrated thing when we're talking about ammo, especially defensive pistol ammo. One thing, the round nose, like 115 grain, tends to be one of the most reliable feeding things you can have. So if you just be wary, don't assume that your gun is going to feed 147 grain truncated cone bullets. Well, some guns do, some guns don't. I don't know this for sure, but it seems to me like guns are probably engineered for the 115 to 124s because they're more common. Now, obviously, expanding ammunition is what you want for defense. Expanding, commonly referred to as hollow point ammunition, although some rounds expand without being a hollow point, like the Federal Guard dogs. But expanding ammunition, for a lot of reasons, mostly that it does more damage in tissue, is what you want for defensive use. Handgun rounds tend to be not very effective for stopping people when compared to rifle and pistol, or rifle and shotgun rounds rather. So you want to get all the advantage you can get. And one of the big misconceptions that I hear all the time, even from people that I think should probably know that this is not true, but they say carry what your local law enforcement carries. Well, not unless you're carrying the gun that they carry. Because expanding ammunition is very velocity based. Expansion is based on velocity. And you get to a threshold where if you drop below that point, that ammo won't expand. Most police officers are generally carrying a full-size fighting handgun. Now, I do conceal carry from day to day a full-size fighting handgun. As I'm talking to you right now, I have a 6-hour M17 on my hip. That is a full-size fighting handgun. In fact, it's the U.S. military's current full-size fighting handgun. But most people don't do that. Most people carry, an M&P Shield or a SIG 365 or, a Taurus G2, whatever. Can't keep up with the models of Taurus coming out with new ones all the time. Not that that's bad. But anyway, most people are carrying a compact, subcompact size, micro even, handgun. Which means you're going to lose velocity. If you guys don't know this is kind of ballistics 101. If you cut the barrel length down in general, especially for most common size handguns, you're going to cut down the amount of powder that burns in that barrel, which means you lose velocity. So the velocity at which a police officer is propelling that same load, even if you buy the same load and load out of the same box, you're going to get generally much less velocity out of your handgun than that police officer is. So just because the local police department carries that round does not mean you should carry that round. It very likely will not expand out of your handgun. Now it may not, but just because a cop in your local jurisdiction, sheriff, police department, whatever, carries that round does not at all mean that you should carry that round. It doesn't right off the bat exclude it. Some of those rounds do quite well out of a short barrel, but some don't. Some you'll find will not expand even at close distances out of your micro compact, subcompact, whatever you want to call it. So I'd say that is not good advice. What is good advice is find some research on a similar barrel length that you have, even better if it's the same model of gun, because all kinds of things, twist rates and bore diameter and all kinds of factors, polygonal rifling versus traditional rifling, the number of rifle grooves. There's so many things that can change the effect of a bullet. So if at all possible, find testing from your similar length barrel, and if possible, the same barrel, meaning same rifling and all that stuff, to see whether they actually work out of your gun. There are some good resources on YouTube. There are some bad resources on YouTube. So be mindful, make sure it's applicable to your situation, and make sure it's reliable. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. Not a witness that takes a bribe. For a bribe, forgive me today, folks, I don't think I'm going to go back and re-record when I misspeak. I'm just going to power through it. Per the Bible, per God's law, a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. So don't take bribes. People that you see that get free stuff and get paid by certain companies, endorsed by certain companies, It doesn't mean their information is wrong, but it does mean that they're probably biased, so keep that in mind as well. But some rounds that have a good reputation and have for a long time, Spear Gold Dots. And again, I take no bribes. I get no free ammo from any of these companies or anything like that. But from my own training and experience, these ammo works pretty well. And that's going to be your Spear Gold Dots. They're pretty much a standard. Also, your Federal Hydra-Shocks and your HSTs for Hydra-Shock 2. Those have a pretty good reputation. Remington Golden Sabres, they've been okay. They have a pretty good bullet shape for feeding in a lot of finicky guns. Hornady Critical Duties and Critical Defense. And your Winchester Ranger and Ranger Ts. They are probably my go-to load, the Winchester Ranger Ts. Do your own research, but they may or may not be basically a black Talon without the black coating, which the black coating didn't do a whole lot as far as terminal ballistics, I don't think. But the Winchester Rangers and Ranger Ts are pretty good ammo. I think it is the PDX line are pretty similar and marketed towards civilians. They may even be the same bullet loaded up, I'm not sure. Now we'll talk about powder. Now you're probably, unless you're a reloader, which is a whole different episode, but unless you're a reloader, you probably don't know what powder is in there, but know that a lot of defensive rounds will use low flash powder, which if you're consider yourself and title yourself a gunfighter, you should probably train in low light situations, and that can make a difference. It may or may not bother you. But as far as powder, that's probably all we'll talk about today. Let's talk about casings. Casings, your most common one is brass. Brass is what it was designed for. That's what, your 9mm was designed around, as a brass case. The steel case stuff, I don't run that crap. If you want to run it, that's fine. I don't really see the wisdom in spending good money on a gun and then running ammo that is much more likely to wear it out and break it sooner. If you want to run steel ammo, steel cased ammo, that's okay. Just know that a lot of that steel cased ammo is also bimetal jacket ammo, which means that the jacket of the bullet is not actually copper. It is a steel jacket washed in a very thin copper wash, chemical plating. And just think for yourself whether a steel bullet ripping down a steel barrel is good or not. I stay away from them. You can do what you want. It's your gun, your money, your ammo. And the next big one is nickel. You'll see nickel on a lot of defensive cases. Now, the whole case I don't believe is nickel. It's just nickel plated, which has a few advantages. A lot of times, a big advantage is you can look at a glance and tell whether your gun's loaded up with defensive ammo or regular ammo, because usually regular ammo is not nickel plated. So that in and of itself is nice. They say that the nickel plated stuff is slicker, which should help in feeding and reliability, and if it's a defensive situation, why not get all the advantages you can? Also, they say more corrosion resistance. You ought to not let your defensive ammo get that corroded, I guess. But anyway, those are all some advantages of the nickel plating. Next, we'll move back to the primer. And again, unless you're a reloader, you're probably just going to assume that the ammunition you have loaded, the primers are loaded by that manufacturer, i.e. if it's a Winchester round, Winchester primer. In my experience from reloading and competition shooting and things like that, in general, the softest primers are Federal, and I like that, because a primer soft means it's more likely to get detonated, especially in a dirty gun for whatever reason. So I like that, but you may want a harder primer for other reasons. If you're getting light strikes, having a hard time your gun detonating rounds, number one, clean it, lube it, make sure you don't need to replace that firing pin spring or that striker spring, depending on however your thing is designed, your handgun is designed, maybe your hammer spring. But that being said, if you are getting light strikes, Federal primers, in my experience, tend to be the softest and most reliable detonating. A lot of your NATO rounds, if they're NATO spec, tend to have fairly hard primers. Also tend to have some kind of water sealant, whether that be chemical, some kind of compound. You'll often see red around the primer. That's a water sealant, moisture sealant. Or sometimes they'll even stamp it to squish it in there to stop it from, one, backing out, and two, to help prevent stuff from getting in there, which is an advantage in and of itself, so you may want to weigh that stuff out. I hope that you're listening to this and realizing that 9mm ammo can be quite a bit more in-depth than just going to Walmart, or I guess not, Walmart doesn't sell handgun ammo anymore, sad, but going to your local big box store and buying a box of ammo and throwing it in your gun. It's a lot more complex than that, especially to something you're going to trust your life to. If you just got a 9mm handgun for fun and you just want to go to the range and shoot it, whatever, do what you want. But if it's a gun that you tout yourself as being a gunfighter with and gunfighting with, using it for defensive use as an armed civilian or police, military, law enforcement use. If you're going to be part of a well-regulated militia, you ought to regulate yourself, meaning be well-trained, and think about these things and be circumspect when you're choosing your ammo. Your life and others' lives may depend on it. One of the things you'll know that I'm big on is finding a practice load that matches very well with your defensive load. Don't be the guy that practices all the time with 115 grain cheap, whatever bulk pack of ammo, and then carries your 135 grain duty load having never tested it. They probably don't shoot in the same place. They might, but likely they'll shoot very, very differently, meaning point of aim, point of impact. And to me, the number one thing if I'm going to get in an encounter is hitting what I'm aiming at. Is that not the point of shooting, hitting what you're aiming at? So don't trust your life to something unproven and carry a defensive round that doesn't hit the same place as your practice round. Spend a little bit more time, money, and effort. It might be expensive, but you know what's expensive? Death. Death is expensive. So do your due diligence and get a round that matches your practice ammo and your duty ammo. Again, that bullet shape is important. If it's not exactly the same bullet shape and everything, and designed that way to be the same velocity, same bullet shape, everything, as in your Spear Lawman and your Spear Gold Dots, then make sure you're running some of your defensive loads and making sure they work in your gun. Don't assume that they do. You can have a very good brand that's known for being a reliable gun and a very good brand known for being reliable ammo, and they may not work well together. I've seen this many times. Even with Glocks. I've had it happen with the Glocks, and my wife's had it happen with Glocks, where we had very good defensive ammunition, very good reputable brands, and they didn't run in those guns. I'm not going to say what those brands of ammo work. There's nothing wrong with the brand of ammo. They just didn't work in that gun. But like recently with my wife and her Glock 42, just out of the box, did not work with some ammo. And we found ammo that it did work with. Don't just assume. With that, guys, the battery is running low on the laptop. I appreciate you listening to this with probably subpar audio quality, but I'd rather get you guys out some content rather than not. Hope you'll overlook that. I hope that you will consider supporting the podcast. Before I forget, let's go into the tactical tip of the day. Tactical tip of the day: a lot of us that concealed carry a spare mag pouch with a spare magazine. Well, a good thing to have if you have a gun is earplugs. Maybe you're out and about walking or running in the wilderness, out on a drive in the wilderness, and you decide you want to stop and pull over and shoot and make sure your gun works and test some of your rounds. And with that, you may want earplugs. Foamies, those little foam earplugs are cheap. You can throw generally one or two, you probably want two. Throw two of those in the bottom of your spare mag pouch and put your magazine on top of it. Make sure it doesn't interfere with anything with feeding or drawing out that and doing reloads or anything. They generally squish down pretty low. That's a good thing about them. And they're there if you need earplugs. With that, that's going to bring us to where I talk about if you want to support the podcast. I'll make it brief today. Please consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com. These podcast episodes are free for you to listen to, and I like that. I want the least of these to be able to listen to these episodes and glean knowledge and understanding, but they're not free to produce and put out. If you want to support, please consider becoming a patron by going to Patreon. Again, you can get there at goodshepherdtraining.com. With that, the tactical verse of the day. Remember, it's not the tools that save. It's not your gun that saves. Jesus saves. God saves. Psalm 20. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. God is my Savior, my shield, my refuge, my high tower, and my fortress. Now Jesus tells his disciples to have swords. You'll find that in the Gospel of Luke. But the sword is not your Savior. Jesus is your Savior. Remember that, and have a blessed day.